Senator Duniam.
President, following that, which as the Leader of the Opposition in the Senate characterised, it's my opportunity to put on record the Coalition's position on this bill, but having, as has already been pointed out, the opportunity for 2 weeks to, in the last sitting fortnight, to examine such matters instead of others, we now have this being considered an urgent piece of legislation. But that is passing strange, given what this legislation actually does. I think it's important to reiterate points that have been made in the other place by the Shadow Minister for Energy, Ted O'Brien, on this, and that is that this legislation is bad legislation and indeed reflects bad policy. How this legislation is characterised by those opposite and those who've supported it is misleading to those in the community calling for action on climate, and indeed the actual impacts this legislation will have on the matter around climate change and what the impact of carbon emissions and the amount there is in the atmosphere is also misleading in the debate. I think as we consider the legislation that the Labor government has brought in, it's also important to consider that the promise around legislating an emissions reductions target of 43%, which we oppose legislating, there was another promise made, and that was a promise around cutting the cost of electricity for Australian households and Australian businesses. A promise that as soon as we arrived here to start conducting business on the first day of Parliament, this 47th Parliament, it was a promise that was abandoned. $275 a year by the year 2025, something pledged 97 times in the lead up to the election and not mentioned once since. So, two promises, one on emissions reduction being legislated, a target being legislated, and the government is delivering on that promise by legislating it. It is something we said we would not do and therefore oppose for reasons I'll outline shortly, enshrining in legislation. But another promise concurrently which has been abandoned, completely wiped off the books, as if no one will notice. And today of all days, of course, when the Reserve Bank of Australia will no doubt hand down a decision which will spell out further pain for Australian households when it comes to their monthly budgets, mortgage rates going up, power prices going up, fuel, all of those going up. But instead, we're focusing on legislating a target to reduce emissions, which, frankly speaking, won't do what those opposites say it will. So it does really, though, demonstrate the priorities of this government, and indeed how close to the dining table conversations, the living room conversations that are taking place out there in Australia. I'm pretty sure that households universally are talking about the impact on their weekly budget that power prices are having, that fuel prices are having, and they want a government to act on those things. But instead, here we are in this first proper sitting week where we can deal with business talking about this issue. And as I say, that broken promise around not dealing with power prices, but instead only dealing with a reduction in emissions being enshrined in legislation, is going to be extremely evident to all as time marches on. And every time people look at this legislation and the debate that's taking place, they'll be reminded of it. So it is very telling that, of course, Labor have abandoned that promise, and in doing so abandoned most of Australia, those people who are going to struggle with those bills. And we know already that power prices, as of June this year, are $208 higher than they were in the same month last year. And of course, it's going to get much worse. It's also important to point out a couple of the points that were made by my colleague in the other place, Ted O'Brien, the member for Fairfax and Shadow Minister for Energy, that this bill isn't needed at all. And it's a point that was actually made by the relevant minister, the Minister for Energy and Climate Change, Minister Bowen, who said, and I quote, "We do not need it," referring to this legislation, and we've also been clear that this legislation is not required. Points made by the government themselves in relation to the necessity or otherwise of introducing this bill. It's symbolic, it's tokenistic. It was a point that was made by the Greens environment spokesperson in an interview yesterday, that this is purely symbolic. it doesn't actually do anything, at least insofar as the primary bill is concerned. So, that being the case, not needing to enshrine it, why are we doing this? There's a lot of things that this bill doesn't do. Sadly, one of the things it doesn't do is it won't end green lawfare. We only saw yesterday in the Australian Financial Review, the Australian Greens have said that the 43% target being enshrined in legislation won't end climate wars. And again, I refer to the comments of the Greens Environment spokesperson, Senator Hanson-Young, who said the climate wars will not end this week with the passage of this climate bill, which was something we were promised would happen. We're going to end the climate wars so long as the Labor's climate bill keeps approving new coal and gas, end of quote. So there's another thing this bill doesn't do. It doesn't reduce emissions, it doesn't end the climate wars, it doesn't bring down power prices. In fact, quite the opposite, I expect, Mr Acting Deputy President. So, having looked at those things this bill doesn't do, despite promises made before the election, promises made during this debate, let's have a look at some of the things it does do. And one of the great places to start looking at some of these issues is in the dissenting report handed down by coalition senators on the Senate inquiry into this bill. And I think it's pretty important to note that this bill and the consequential amendments bill will be pretty damaging when it comes to the economy and particularly regional Australia. It's going to have a massively adverse impact on jobs, on infrastructure, on major projects, on national security, on the well-being of rural and regional communities, and even the day-to-day existence of many Australians. Household budgets, like we were talking about before. It's important to point out also that the government, in drafting this legislation, have patently ignored the experience of other jurisdictions that have gone on to legislate emissions reductions targets. You only have to look at Europe to see what has happened there, and there are a range of examples, again outlined in the Coalition Senators' dissenting report to the committee inquiry, where in the United Kingdom we've seen a range of critical infrastructure projects either delayed or completely blocked because of green lawfare, something we knew would happen. We predicted this, and we are warning Australians when this bill passes, this is going to be a green light for this sort of activity. In the UK, crucial projects like their HS2 high-speed rail network delayed because of legislated emissions reductions targets. Major road projects, the third runway at Heathrow Airport delayed for years because of enshrined legislated targets for emissions reduction. In France, of course, we have their sovereign government being told that they'll be subject to penalties if they don't take necessary measures on climate change by the end of 2022 by one of their courts. So we have the judiciary telling the legislature and the executive what to do. And it's no different in Germany when, in April of last year, German courts ordered the government to increase its emissions reductions targets. So you've got courts who are not elected, as far as I'm aware, by the people telling those elected by the people what to do. This is the byproduct of legislating these targets, and this is why the Coalition has sounded the alarm bell and opposes these moves. I think also another telling factor in this debate is the fact that no modelling was actually undertaken by government departments in preparation for the introduction of this legislation. One of the signature promises by the Labor government, alongside that $275 power price reduction that was promised but abandoned. No modelling. The Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry and also the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment each testified, and astonishingly, none of them, neither of those departments, were asked to do any modelling on the impacts on rural and regional Australia or the economy. What a revelation. That's unbelievable. And indeed, the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry was not even formally consulted on the consequential amendments bill prior to its introduction, evidence tendered at the committee. Infrastructure Australia has also admitted to the committee that it could not yet even explain the consequences of the two bills and how they should make decisions when trying to balance environmental and economic impacts, something I think Australians expect us to do, to maintain balance between economy and environment, because of course we need a functioning economy to live, as well as a healthy environment. And of course then turning to the entity Export Finance Australia, who are certain to struggle now when it comes to its vital work in supporting projects in countries right across the Pacific, something we as a nation here have a responsibility to do. And the same could be said of the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility too. So with that little amount of work done, no consultation, no regard for unintended consequences, no concern for the people of rural and regional Australia who will likely bear the brunt of these enshrined targets and the increased cost of living, the impact on jobs and the economy. And indeed, perhaps, of course, people who are going to be forced into energy poverty as power prices continue to skyrocket. And again, I remind senators and those listening of the broken promise to reduce power prices by $275 annually by 2025. A promise broken so early on in the term. And of course there are other considerations related to the government's response to managing the environment, be it the 30% of land locked up by 2030. How are they going to do it? What are they going to do to assist in reaching these enshrined targets? What impact will that have on farmers and other land users? How are they going to manage these commitments they've made and the impacts that they will then have on Australians seeking to make an honest dollar to pay their bills, the bills that are going up? These things have not been considered at all. And the National Farmers Federation President Fiona Simpson said in relation to this land lock-up proposal, locking up land is not the answer. It has the potential to have a reverse effect on biodiversity, and with a lack of land management allowing feral animals and plants to flourish, heightening the risk from fire, drought and floods. And of course we know fires are a major contributor to carbon emissions, and so we need to consider these things, which I just don't think the government have done. So look, as was stated by the member for Fremantle in the other place, the government have made it very clear this is the beginning and not the end. And that, I think, is an important note for us to hover on. I've outlined my concerns and the opposition's concerns around this legislation. They say it's just targets in legislation. Don't worry, it'll be okay. We've heard about other jurisdictions where targets are enshrined in legislation, and we know what impact that has. They're not made-up examples. They happened. There are courts ordering governments to do things which were not part of a mandate, which have not been tested by the people of those countries. They are things being forced on governments. They have an impact on the cost of living, something we should all be concerned about. There's not been much debate in here about this. The government hasn't brought forward legislation to deal with those issues. Singularly, we are dealing with this, enshrining targets in legislation to reduce emissions. So as the member for Fremantle says, this is beginning, not the end. What's next? Where do we go from here? When do we start striking a balance with concern for people's ability to pay their power bills, which are going up in my home state of Tasmania, 12% increase in one hit? And we're a renewable energy generator in Tasmania. Hydro, wind, solar, that's what we rely on down there, but we've got a 12% increase. Where does it end? Where do the targets end? You only have to have a look at other policy proposals, legislative proposals that are being considered at the moment around, say, the safeguards mechanism. I'd love to hear the government provide a guarantee that not one job will be lost in some of those trade-exposed and emissions-intensive industries, in some of those emitters across the country, particularly in rural and regional communities. In northern Tasmania, we have 5 or 6 of them that cumulatively employ 2,000 people. I'd love a commitment that not one job will be lost. But instead, I don't think we will get that. I think we'll have a focus on bringing emissions down with no regard for the economy, with no regard for those jobs, and indeed, as I've outlined here, no regard for what impact this will have on Australian households, their ability to pay their bills, to keep the lights on, to keep warm in winter in places like Tasmania, to keep food on the table. This bill, sadly, is worse than it seems. both sets of bills, and I warn senators to consider carefully before they cast their vote. We will oppose this bill.